So let's dive straight in. What makes a successful initiative? So I'm going to talk you through some criteria. What does a successful initiative make? And especially since you've already looked at some case studies, that's probably you were probably wondering the same thing. What does a successful intervention, behavior change intervention look like? And what do we mean when we say if they're successful? So the first thing that we mean is it is effective, and the second thing is it means it's sustained. So it does actually change behavior, and that behavior is changed sustainably. So it's not happening for a limited period of time, but the effect is going to carry on. And I'm going to talk you through the typical criteria of successful initiatives based on an example around composting, a composting campaign. So we can broadly separate success criteria or successful traits of an intervention into three categories. So the first category is context analysis. So understanding your context, understanding where you are, where your intervention sits. The second one is certain aspects of the design and development process. So when you think of your project, your intervention, your campaign, you use certain tools in your design and development process. And the third one, which is pretty important, you will see that a lot in change management and or projects like international development and that sort of thing, is monitoring and evaluation. So really looking at your outcomes and your outputs. So what does context analysis mean? It means that you clearly understand, first of all, what are the behaviors that you want to foster, and by who. So really having that, what we call a behavior actor pair. So who do you want to influence? Who do you want to change? And really well defining what is that behavior that you want that person or that group, that actor to adopt. So really defining that, making it very clear in your process, in your campaign, in your initiative, who are you talking to and what is the outcome that you want to achieve. Then you will look at the surrounding the context. So what are the typical characteristics of the setting? So we call that the socio-ecological context. So what is around it? What are the typical power systems? What are typical institutions? Who influences who? What are there any dependencies in economically? So who benefits from who? Where does money come from? Where does money go? And that sort of thing. So trying to go beyond the typical prejudice and the typical, oh, it's a, we're a village, so there are going to be a lot of farmers sort of thing, but really looking into what are the actual, and especially your actors that are trying to influence. So when we look at our composting example, for example, what we were trying to do is get a special set of actors, so for example gardeners, or for example farmers, to do more composting. So that should be that's our example initiative. So what we're trying to do, the behavior actor pair, is we're trying to get landowners to adopt composting instead of burning it, instead of letting things go into household waste. We want them to start adopting composting. So the surrounding, for example, might be looking at where does their waste usually go, who are people that they look up to. So, for example, if we talk about farmers, if they are our targeted actors, are they organized in groups? Do they have certain role models in the area? Is there anyone that is particularly influential with them? Are there any economical barriers or incentives that we could use, and that sort of thing? So really trying to get to grasp of where our target audience, our actors sit, and the interdependencies that are. And from that on, we can then get to the barriers and the motivations, which are really a key aspect of any intervention that you, or any campaign that you're running regards to behavior change. Is you really want to get to know that your actors, your audiences, barriers and motivations. So what is keeping them from changing their behaviors, and what would motivate them to change their behaviors? So when we look at the composting example, what are barriers to composting? Is it not accessible to them? Is it too costly? Is it, so what might be potential barriers? And then also, what are the motivations? So are they mostly driven by money, or are they mostly driven by I don't know, social pressures, or what could be motivations that we could use to get them to change their behaviors? So after we understood the context, we are starting to, oh, sorry, get the feedback. We'll start designing and developing our campaign. Sorry, I get an echo.
I think that's maybe Alana came in on a second computer, perhaps. I think that's where the problem might be.
Sorry, I'm sorting various technical difficulties. I'm having a real struggle, and I've got you all on mute at the moment to try and deal with the feedback, because I am logged in on 2 devices. So I'll be with you when I can. Keep going.
Okay. So we've understood our audience, we've understood our actors, we've understood the context that they live in, what drives them, what are the barriers, and now we start to actually design and develop our campaign, our intervention. And one term that you will keep hearing is, or that you might be already familiar with, is theory of change. And that is basically when we talk about behavior change, it is what are we trying to, it's basically breaking it down, what we're trying to achieve, into 3 main elements. So we're using our intervention and certain elements of our intervention, and they are designed to have certain behavioral outputs. So if we look at our composting example, so we might decide that the best way to get farmers to start composting is by offering them a incentive, a monetary incentive. We say, you start composting and you will get a discount, for example, on certain goods and items, or on taxes or whatever. So that is the interventional element that we thought up with. And then the behavioral output is they are going to start composting. They are going to stop, put certain items on a pile and burn it. But the behavior output is they stop doing the burning and start putting their output into a composting unit. And then that behavioral output will have environmental and social outcomes. So that is basically the benefit at the end of that process, is we will have less air pollution because we get less fires. We will have and we will have less pollution, less greenhouse gases because we have less fires. And we might also get some some topsoil or something, you know, compost back that we can then actually use again. So the element is we're giving them an incentive, for example, tax reduction. The behavior change is they are starting to compost or do more composting, and the environmental outcome is we get compost to use and we get less air pollution. What we haven't quite taken into account yet is all the work that we've done before. So if we really look back at the contextual analysis, that is something that happens in between here. So we might have seen that actually our farmers, they aren't really that driven by monetary considerations. They are more driven by social status, or they actually really care about their local ecology. So these psychological and social insights are what should really inform our link of intervention elements and behavioral outputs. So the behavioral output for our composting example is we want to get them to stop burning and start composting. And in our insight, we have found that the best way to do that, their motivation is actually not earning money, but doing better by their local environment. So the intervention element might be that we show them how bad it is to burn. To burn, and how bad their output rather than composting is it. And so our intervention element might be an education campaign rather than tax benefits or something, or it might be that we show them, or if composting is good for their local wildlife or their animals that they are keeping, and so on. So that is really where that first step, the contextual analysis, comes in. It should really inform which sort of intervention elements you're selecting. And why we call it intervention elements is because you might have a program, a campaign, an intervention that consists of more than one thing. It might be a huge composting campaign that consists of tax cuts, it consists of education, and it consists of free trial kits, for example, for those that can't afford to make the investment themselves. So it might be that you choose several elements for different parts of your audience, and putting that all together is then your intervention, your campaign. And another thing that is very shows very much success and is a good way to do it is trial and testing. So again, the composting campaign, you might trial your tax reduction with some of the farmers. You might offer it to them and see what the uptake is. And if the uptake is really good, then that shows you that that your intervention is successful, and you might want to upscale it. Or if you're doing an education campaign, you might want to do it in one school first or in one setting first, see how it goes, and then based on that success, you upscale it. So testing prototypes with certain subgroups of your actors, of your targeted audience, is a really good way of doing it. So that's the design and development process. And the last bit, which mainly comes after you've run your campaign, is the monitoring and evaluation. And the aim of this bit is to generate actionable information. So why have we added the actionable in there? Because it's nice to capture a lot of information, but if you can't actually make use of it, it's not really of value. So when you, for example, create surveys or want to, design your monitoring and evaluation exercises, you want to make sure that you only capture data that you can that's actually useful and meaningful to your project. So, for example, you might want to capture the behavioral, psychological, and social outputs. So, for example, for our composting campaign, that might be we check in every now and then and see and ask our farmers how much composting they are actually doing. So that is the behavioral output. How much have they actually shifted away from burning their output to composting it? And we might also capture environmental outcomes by looking at our air quality monitors. So we might see that with less fires in the area, we see an improvement in air quality. An interesting one, which will not be relevant to all of your, definitely not your campaigns or generally, is sometimes it is good to prepare with a what if. So the technical term is a valid counterfactual. So that means we compare what happened after we did our intervention with some group that didn't have an intervention. So it's kind of like the placebo comparison that you get in medicine. So you have a look at, again, if we look at the composting example, if we look at our stats that we have in the area where we've run the campaign, so we see that people are actually picking up composting and they are reducing the amounts of fires. We need to compare that with other parts, other similar areas, because it might be that it's a national trend. It might be that it's not actually our intervention that changed it, but it might be a general trend, general awareness that fires are bad for the air quality, and that you should really be composting your output. So comparing with a national trend or a group that hasn't had the intervention can be quite useful, because it will really tell you how effective your intervention was. Again, it's probably not that applicable to a lot of your programs or projects that you're thinking of, or activities, but it is something to be aware when you see successful campaigns or something that is sold to you as a successful campaign, to ask yourself, well, was that really the intervention, or was that maybe just a national trend coinciding? And the last point is continue the evaluation a while after the program stopped, because that is that linking back to that first point about the sustained change. It might be that the farmers have started to compost for 1 or 2 years, but then they might leap back to burning their outputs rather than composting. So the only way of seeing whether you have actually change their behavior in the long run, effectively in the long run, is by monitoring the outcomes of a longer period of time. So those are the criteria under the 3 headings. So context analysis, really finding out who are your actors, what is their reality, their context, where they don't exist in isolation. So what are those influences around them that you should be aware? What are their motivations and barriers? And then designing and developing your intervention, you need to be very, very clear. What is your theory of change? So what is the intervention that is then creating a certain output and then a certain outcome? And also linking it back to what you've learned in your context analysis. really trying to speak to the motivations and barriers of your actors, and be brave to test. It's better to test and fail on a smaller scale than on a bigger scale, and then monitor your effects in the long run. Something that is very common are surveys. Check in with people that you've spoken to or that attended your events, see how they are doing, and whether you were actually able to help them in the long run.